the main focus of what we're talking about today is this thing called the Joseph Rodgers year knife. This is also another sort of start for us again, because we've just got another heritage lottery project. Well, in the lifetime I've been helping with the Hawley collection, we're on our second lottery project, and we've got a lottery project around Sheffield treasures. And I suppose if you said to me, why do I do this? It's because I like Sheffield. I like everything about Sheffield. I'm not a Sheffielder. I've only lived here just over 40 years, but I love Sheffield. And I don't know, you drill down on things to do with Sheffield and you think, you know, it's really interesting and wonderful, and we want to celebrate them. So, celebrating the 200th birthday, or the 199th birthday, or the 201st birthday of the Joseph Rodgers year knife. There's a bit of just a sort of image, really. And whenever I see a good news story about Sheffield, I like it. And this is a good news story about Sheffield, but this was a good news story about Sheffield 200 years ago. This was Sheffield just saying to the world, I guess, and, you know, particularly the Americas, the Commonwealth, we're really good at what we do. We're really proud of what we do. And just to prove it, we're going to produce things of such outstanding quality that nobody else will be able to make in the world. And I suppose there is just that notion of thinking, what was Sheffield like in 1822? Well, I mean, a few sort of, you know, contemporary things. So in 1821, the Sheffield Canal was opened. You know, so almost when this knife was made. Now, just think about that. So Sheffield was making quality goods before 1819. How on earth did they get them out of the city? They were metal. They had weight to them. So basically, the obvious place to get them if you wanted to export them by boat was Bawtry. You know, so it's more or less saying, right, you know, there's your donkey, there's your mule, Bawtry's in that direction, go for it. You know, and I guess it took you a few days to do it. You know, what were these metal items? What were they held in? Probably small barrels, I suspect. You know, and equally, if you wanted to go in the other direction, well, you know, it was a bit like, right, off up the Snake Pass, then get yourself to Glossop, then get yourself to, you know, then get yourself to Manchester, then get yourself to Liverpool. And you know, around this time, Sheffield companies were viewing with the export market, particularly America, okay, and then also getting to London. James Dixon was Master Cutler. Obviously, we've still got the Cutlers Company. We still have Master Cutlers. In those days, the Master Cutler was a cutler. These days, the Master Cutler will be a prominent Sheffield engineer. But there are parallels between the Dixon family and the Rodgers family that we might touch later. The population of Sheffield in 1821 was 65,275. Probably slightly deceptive, because there might be an issue about where was the boundary of Sheffield in those days. And I'm sure the places like Stocksbridge and Ecclesfield that still think they're part of the West Riding probably definitely were part of the West Riding in those days. Pen and pocket knife makers, there were 2,380 in the city. It was a big trade, okay, and a lot of the cutlery specialists, you know, there was probably more people making pen and pocket knives than there were people making table knives. The Cutler's Hall was built in 1832. Just think the relief when the railway came to Sheffield in 1840. You know, you could get to London. It was probably a bit like now. I'm not sure what the east-west links were like. But anyway, just that whole notion. 1851, the great exhibition at Crystal Palace, which was a bit of a notion of, you know, Britain saying, look at us, aren't we great? I was thinking when I was doing this talk, I was thinking, well, you know, how many overseas visitors came to the great exhibition? You weren't going to get there from America or Australia, I don't suspect. You know, so a lot of it would have been for domestic audience or people who could get there relatively close by. But it certainly represented a peak, a sort of highlight of what was going on in those times. And just fast forward to 1914, Joseph Rodgers was the largest cutlery firm in the city. There weren't many cutlery firms that employed more than 1,000 people. And Joseph Rodgers was one of the companies that employed more than 1,000 people. This is a piece of marketing from the Joseph Rodgers company, and there's a bit of a sense of this is a history of the company that was published by the company. You know, so obviously they're not going to tell any of the downside of the company in those days, but there's a number of things immediately jumping out from this picture. The notion about royal appointment. You know, I was thinking that there's a few things that, you know, when you get a jar of Tate and Lyle treacle, somewhere on the bottom of it, it's got, you know, by royal appointment, isn't it? And there still are things out there occasionally. I suspect very few of us look for the royal appointment when we're out doing our weekly shopping. But again, just think back to that different age in 1822. If you wanted endorsement, if you want somebody to say, you know, you should buy our product. I was thinking, you know, just think of the death of the Queen and the fact that, if you like, the country sort of raised its level of royal awareness and royal interest. Well, again, I think go back 200 years and I think that was probably much, much stronger. And so any endorsement from the sovereign was going to be quite substantial. And Joseph Rodgers, of course, one of the things they had the endorsement of 5 sovereigns. Okay. Other things that I suppose were worthy to put on the front of their, the front of their history: Joseph Rodgers and Sons Limited, Sheffield, cutlers to their majesties. And the other thing then, we've got this registered trademark granted in 1682. Quite a lot of Sheffield cutlery companies, they'll have some date that sometimes it feels like it's been a bit plucked out the air about when they were formed. And it's almost like the further they can go back, the better in terms of marketing. So, I don't know, some books say that in 1682, there was some possibility of somebody with the name of Rodgers who were making cutlery in Stannington or Brightside. And I suppose, these big companies that grew to over 1,000 people at some point would have had a single person, so somebody called Joseph Rodgers. But, obviously as time goes on, the records become stronger. So 1701 to 1785, we've got workshops rented by John Rodgers at Hawley or Hawley Croft, a back street off Campo Lane. And I suppose if we just looked at that picture outside of the context of manufacturing, we think, well, that's just somebody's private residence. And I suppose, again, we might have a few self-employed people in the audience, but generally we don't live at the place where we work. But in terms of that notion, you've got manufacturing taking place as well as probably living with a family or other families with all the dirt and pollution that went with it. 1724, the first mark awarded by the companies was a star and a Maltese cross. But actually, somebody had that mark before. And so something that happened with some of these cutlery marks, they were sometimes borrowed from other people. So the mark had previously been used by another cutler, William Burks. So essentially, in 1724, they loaned the mark. They borrowed it. Whether there was a financial transaction, I don't know. Later on, this was consolidated as their mark. And in a sense, that was preciously guarded by them, although in an earlier talk, we've mentioned quite a few other companies actually used a Maltese cross, and I don't know how they got away with that. But it was something that was famous all over the world, the mark that they actually had. And John Rodgers, who lived in Hawley Croft, he had 3 sons, John, Joseph and Maurice, who followed him in the trade. So it was a good family company. There was a bit of a sense of, if your dad was a cutler, then you're going to be a cutler too. In 1774, the brothers were listed as penknife and razor makers. It is interesting, that notion about, what is a penknife? What is a penknife? What is a pocket knife? What is a folding knife? And, I mean, the obvious thing is saying, well, a penknife was for, it was for sharpening a quill. It was for cutting a quill down so you could write with it. That's pretty straightforward. And I know at one point we were thinking, well, and, it would only have one blade. And actually, it might have been fixed originally. So it wasn't a folding knife at all. But then we find we've got pen knives that have got 2 blades. So the distinction does get very blurred. And so we've almost got to the point now, a bit like with cutlery, anything that you use at the table is referred to as cutlery. Well, any sort of folding knife tends to be referred to as a pen knife, but there is that notion about what is the definition. So Rodgers were doing quite well on the pen knives and the razor making. 1780, more workshops acquired in Sycamore Street. And they also acquired premises at 6 Norfolk Street. Now, that's the sort of prestigious address. That is the place that, again, became totally synonymous with Joseph Rodgers and his company. On the right here, we've got a penknife that actually is on display in Sheffield museums in town, in the Millennium galleries. And, one of the tragedies of museums is they can't display everything that they've got. And one of the things we rarely get in museums is displays that are themed around a manufacturer. So it's a bit like if you said, I want to see everything about Joseph Rodgers in the city, it's all over the place. After 1800, they added table cutlery and scissors to their range. And in 1821, Geoffrey Tweedale, who's a big sort of commentator on the whole Sheffield cutlery industry, he identified there were adverts with sailing ships on them. So they were definitely, looking at that export market, particularly to America. Joseph Rodgers had 4 sons, and one of them, John, was born in 1799, seemed to be the driving force in the firm. And what stood out from this company was the quality and the range of products. Now, I'm sure if you'd said to James Dixon at the time, Do you make quality products? They would have said, yes, they do. Mapping and Webb, there's a whole load of Sheffield companies that stood on quality, but actually, Rodgers would have argued that they were the best. So a bit of a notion about, what were the ingredients of success? Family business, quality, strong trademark, going out on the road selling. Now, those first three items, if you were talking about James Dixon, would have been exactly the same. Okay? So they were the sort of ingredients of quite a number of big Sheffield companies. So but what was different about Rodgers? Rodgers did all the above, but John went further. So I essentially had three brilliant marketing ideas. Okay? One was the notion of exhibition pieces. Secondly, it was the idea of royal patronage. Thirdly, was the idea of we'll have a showroom. And in a way, that's sort of what we're going to explore today. Exhibition pieces. First exhibition piece, 1890. The press reported a beautiful specimen in the art of cutlery, an elegant knife in miniature containing 30 instruments, moving on 11 springs and 14 joints of exquisite workmanship. It employed the workman 28 days of close application to complete it. It does not exceed more than 5/8 of an inch in length and only weighs 1/4 of an ounce. So this has not been designed to be used. And needless to say, in 1819, they didn't have a 50p piece to compare it to in terms of size. But you've got all sorts. You've got a little saw on there. You've got a button hook. You've got a corkscrew. And, it's basically just showing off. But again, think about a modern company. If a modern company said, right, we're going to take 28 days of one of our workers' wages to make us something to market the product company. So I suppose, one, it suggests the company had quite good resources, and it also suggests a sort of confidence and a pride in this saying, if we can make one of these, this is going to make a difference, and this is going to be good for us. One of the nice things about the Hawley collection is when you're doing a talk like this, you've got to start doing some research. And as well as the physical objects, we've got boxes of ephemera, we've got boxes of photographs. So this is an article in the newspaper in 1984, and it's just literally showing off one of these knives. Well, a similar sort of miniature knife that is for sale. Yeah, so there's a matchstick. I mean, you can't fully appreciate, but this object here is a matchstick to give you a sense of scale. It's got 63 blades. So say it was sold in 1984, and the estimated price it was going for was £1,000. It actually went for £4,000. Interesting, if that was available now, and could you get it for £4,000? So, it begs a question. How many of these miniature knives are actually around in the world? And where have they ended up? And obviously this was some collector in Halesowen. This is another one I found on the internet for sale in 2018. Similar sort of thing. We've got $1 for the lots of demonstration. And this was for sale for $30,000. Okay? And there's a book on the table there, which is it's a book about American knife collectors, but the book is about Sheffield knives. So it's almost like saying, look, there's all these wonderful Sheffield knives, but they're all in the hands of American collectors. There is that notion about, what have we got and where is it? So you could make these exhibition knives, but one of the things, I suppose, was linking these three things together. It was using the exhibition knives as a lever. So in 1821, Stuart Wortley, the MP for Yorkshire, okay, so slightly different parliamentary arrangement, who later became Lord Warncliffe. And what's quite interesting there is if you look through a catalogue of Joseph Rodgers and you look through that American book, there's quite a lot of mentions of knives that got the word Warncliffe in them. Okay? And he presented John Rodgers to the Prince Regent. According to one account, Rodgers presented the Regent, the future George IV, with a 57-blade miniature knife, which was only an inch long when closed. The story goes that when they were presenting it, they dropped it on the carpet, and the pile on the carpet was so big they couldn't find it. Whether that's true or not, I've no idea. Interesting, a 46-piece, I think it's referring to this one, 1821 Joseph Rodgers knife is preserved in the Royal Collection and was displayed at Kelham Island Museum in the early 1990s. So in 1822, George IV granted to Rodgers its first royal warrant. Another 14 royal warrants, both from Britain and overseas, followed in the next 80 years. And this is a list in that history that I showed you earlier, where these royal warrants appear. But what's quite interesting is 12 of these warrants were between 1822 and 1830. We've got the usual suspects, King George, William, Duke of Clarence, but there's a few overseas, Prince Leopold. the Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Shahs of Persia, a couple of Shahs of Persia in there, which again was quite impressive. Quite interesting down here, we've got the Duke of Wellington. And that led me to the question. I was thinking, well, when was the Battle of Waterloo? To which the answer is 1815. So again, all contemporaries with this. And I don't know, it feels like Britain went mad. Anything to do with Wellington, Wellington. There's monuments all over the country to Wellington. You can buy sort of souvenirs with Wellington stamped on them. So getting Wellington stamp of approval was really a pretty smart move. So you can see this, the sort of marketing genius here was a bit in overdrive. So you got the royal warrants in 1822, so it's like, tick, done a good job there. After the meeting with the Prince Regent, Rodger did two things. He commissioned the Year Knife. And there it is in its magnificence, which is just across the road. So after this, if you want, or anytime like, you can go and have a look at it. We have it in Sheffield. And say I'm painting this picture, generally there's a lot of stuff that isn't in Sheffield. And even if it is in Sheffield, you can't get access to it. We've got perfect access to this, and it is there. And so it's interesting, that says 1821. In its location in the Hawley collection, there's two sort of like plaques on the wall. One says 1821 and one says 1822. Okay, so either way you cut the cake, it's 200 years old this year. So we need to sort of celebrate its birthday and say, fantastic, let's get it out, let's make a noise about it. And that notion that when it was made in 1821, it had 821 blades. Again, I think there's a slight sense that if you start counting the blades and then you do it again, every time you'll get a different answer. So, whether there's more than 1821 or less, that's another issue. So it's 32 inches high. It's fitted with scissors, a corkscrew, a nail file, a hacksaw, a button hook, and probably other things that we're not sure what they are. Most of the blades were made of crucible steel. The very latter blades were actually have got silver blades on them. So this is the top shot. This is mother of pearl, which is, again, a skilled craft, and generally that came from Australia. We did talk about that a few back if you want to look at that on YouTube. And you can just see there the concentration of blades on there. Taking them out would be one thing and putting them back would be another one. So I've not seen a picture anywhere of all the blades folded in. And it may be because if you folded them all in, it would take you about a week to fold them all out and you'd have nothing left on your fingers at the end of it. We've got some of these specialist implements, a pair of scissors, a sort of saw knife. But, these were not to be used, but they were just showing off this is what we can do. But I suppose, again, it was all about marketing. And, this was the most famous knife in the world. Well, I think, again, it's, thinking in 1822, how on earth did you get a message about something that existed somewhere else? You couldn't look at the telly. You couldn't look at it, you couldn't go to the cinema and see a film about it. So it was only going to be in either the printed word, whatever form that took, which is mainly going to be newspapers on news sheets, or some sort of etching that somebody had actually drawn it. And again, could most people read? Well, a lot of people, I suspect, wouldn't have been able to read, but I guess if they saw a picture or some sort of image of this, or they even saw the real thing, they would have been astounded, You just look at the concentration of blades there, and there's it's in its magnificence. And I think it's a funny thing, as someone who comes in here every week and looks, walks past it every week, I just take it for granted. But there is something about just standing back and thinking, wow, and the people actually made that. So I don't know, if we were going to say what are Sheffield's greatest treasures, this is up there with them, okay? Particularly when we're talking about physical objects. I haven't quite worked out exactly where it's been all that time. So obviously, Joseph Rodgers had showrooms. We'll come back to them. So clearly it spent some time in Joseph Rodgers' showroom. People also say they've seen it at Weston Park, okay? But what was interesting, in 1969, it was up for sale. One hand, the fact it was up for sale seems pretty unbelievable. The other thing, though, nobody in Sheffield, well, not the council or the Cutlers Company or Sheffield Museums, had the resources stroke inclination to buy it. So where was this heading for on the open market? It certainly would not have stayed in Sheffield. And, step in, Stanley Tools. Now, lots of people think Stanley's a Sheffield company. It's not a Sheffield company. It's an American company, but big manufacturing centre in Sheffield. And so, the Year Knife in the reception display room at the Stanley Works in the mid-1970s, a chap called Jerry Kersey, who was like a DJ presenter on Radio Sheffield, they're having a look at it. Totally different case arrangement. And I think there was some sort of metal drum they could drop this into, because I think Stanley Tools did actually take this out on the road as a sort of exhibition, as a sort of exhibition piece. So Stanley Tools bought that, and that's the city. And obviously, Ken was a regular visitor to Stanley Tools. I'm sure he never left with his pockets empty. You know, he had that strong relationship with Stanley Tools as a company. He had a strong relationship, and that's why that knife essentially has come into the collection, the Hawley collection. And when we moved here in 2013, the knife has sort of followed, and essentially now, you know, it's his permanent home. Yeah, so the knife's on display at Rutland Road, and sometimes went out on exhibitions. Spent some time at Cutler's Hall. In 2008, when it went on permanent display, it apparently wasn't in very good condition. So essentially had to be dismantled and put back together again. And that was Stanshaw, Ken, and Lathco Electroplaters Limited. I don't know much about them as a company, but in a sense, it was a sort of team effort. But I suppose it is something about thinking again about some of these treasures. Some of them sometimes will require some maintenance. I can pretty confidently say we've not done anything with it since 2013, but whether we'll have to at some point, I don't know. So we originally said 821, well, blades were added. I think the idealised notion is the blade was added every year, but I think in reality they were probably added in blocks of 5 or 10 because it was too much hassle to dismantle bits and put them back together again. But blades were added to commemorate things like the 1966 World Cup and the 1977 Queen's Jubilee. And in the year 2000, the last blade of solid silver was added by Stanshaw. And there you have, this is a picture from the Star. Again, you know, just found this in the Hawley collection, so it was nice just to see that. And well, it says that's the 2000th blade going on. I say there's speculation whether there is or not 2000 blades. But again, quite a good event to mark that occasion. Right, so we said exhibition knives. Then the other thing was showrooms. So after 1821, the firm opened a showroom at number 6 Norfolk Street. I think it was true that what was typical of these cutlery companies, it had a really smart facade, and then behind it there was a load of workshops, which were probably small workshops. It wasn't a big, highly mechanised factory system. You know, it's what was great about Sheffield is it was people making these quality products, but it's also what did for Sheffield in that we didn't develop a factory system which allowed us to make the things cheaply. But you know, interesting. We're talking about that difficulty of transporting 1821, and these are the sort of vehicles that goods would have been transported. And you can see all these cementation furnaces in the background behind the city. We have some accounts, so the sort of showroom disruption was caused by crowds wanting to see the Norfolk knife. So if you're living in Sheffield in 1822 and it's a dirty, grimy, horrible place where a lot of the time you probably couldn't see your hand in front of you because it was so smoky, and if you got the chance to see something of real quality and real excellence, well, maybe you wanted to go and see it. And they boasted of other impressive knives being there. Now, I've no idea what the Lady Milton's botanical knife is. I don't know how many blades it had. I don't know what it looked like. Not found a picture of that so far. It'll be out there somewhere in some collection. The Duke of Rutland's shooting knife. And it's funny how I looked at that and I was looking at some of the knives made by Rodgers, and some of them were called Rutland. I was thinking, well, what is it about Rutland and Sheffield? You got Rutland Road, you got the Rutland Hotel. Well, the Duke of Rutland lived at Haddon Hall. So, we have these sort of linkages. But the big attraction was the knife valued at 200 guineas, which had been presented to the king, the year knife. Some suggestion that some of the specialist knives, the exhibition knives, were made by outworkers. So there was a chap called John Hanson who could make miniature scissors, lobster and quadrangulars. I've not sussed yet what a lobster. I did wonder if it's just a knife that literally's got a couple of blades sticking out the end, but that's the question I've got. And while doing this talk, I didn't quite. But I've seen them described in a number of books, lobster knives, but and I don't think they're for eating lobsters. I think it's just a shape, something just to explore. Quadrangular knives, and yeah, they are the sort of knife, the base for the knives that your knife is based on, where you have a sort of barrel essentially, and 4 blades come out the end. That was credited to James Crawshaw, and a suggestion that the your knife was actually made by a cutler called Jonathan Crooks. There was a time when there was a company called Brooks and Crooks. So the showrooms expanded. In 1821 to 1860, the showrooms were located in the centre of the building, but in 1860, new showrooms were built and no expense was spared. So the company was obviously doing well. And here's, again, just a description. On entering, display of hunting trophies, including a 10-foot-long elephant tusk weighing 216 pounds, alongside a pair of beautiful shape and size, each 8 feet 7 inches long, weighing 315 pounds, an elephant's head on the wall with 6 feet long tusks, a moose from New Brunswick, horns of Indian buffalo, kudu. Anybody know what that is? Yes, it's an African antelope. I certainly had to look that up last night. I didn't have a clue what that was. The skull of a walrus, tortoise shells, tribal trumpets of ivory, and other objects of interest. Now, again, it's just that notion of thinking, you know, before television, before social media, how did you know what an elephant looked like? You know, in the Cutlers Company logo, there is an elephant. So, you know, people here were really seeing a collection of curiosities. You know, so again, you can just feel there was a real sense of visiting this place. So this is the staircase. You know, it's sort of fancy panelling. You know, obviously the scale of these, you know, the sort of largest versions of the species you could get there. So this was the corner of the staircase at number 6 Norfolk Street. This was the staircase in Norfolk Street. I mean, just, you know, yeah. It looks grand. It's almost like when you're going around a Spanish city or somewhere, you look in some doorway and there's some courtyard with something really fancy behind it. So you can imagine Joe Public in Sheffield, you know, walking through that entrance when, you know, generally the city wasn't known for its prosperous buildings. And again, no, there's your tortoise, you know. Yeah, so it was grand and it was posh. And it was really, you know, it was designed to impress. So inside the exhibition, variety of knives of all shapes and sizes, several specialities made for the exhibition which have become practically world-renowned. 12 pairs of miniature scissors, so small in total weight, half a grain. Well, I don't know what half a grain is, but I guess it's not a lot. A miniature sportsman knife with 57 blades, which when folded is less than an inch long. So it feels like there's quite a lot of those knives with, you know, that were an inch long. A knife in the form of a 6-rayed star forming a portion of the trademark with 144 blades. So again, no photograph of that I've been able to find. And next we come to the celebrated Norfolk knife. So this is the exhibition showroom. If you said to me, what's the heritage project I would love to do in Sheffield, it would be to recreate that. There's a couple of problems. One is there were several companies had showrooms like that. But you know, when I said earlier, there's nowhere in the city where we've got a significant collection on display of a single manufacturer. And again, one of the great things about working in this museum, the catalogues of some of these companies had over 5,000 items in them. And if you look at 2 different catalogues, they're not the same. So the product range was constantly changing. So it's not a surprise that a company like you know, Rodgers could have something like that. And there's a couple of significant things here. You can see we've got these massive pairs of scissors, and we've got this object here in its own dedicated case. It's interesting. I'm wondering what that's next. Now, I sometimes think in the world of, you know, 3D and technology, there should be something where we could do that electronically. But this is the Norfolk knife. So it's funny, you know, this is a sort of partner to the Ur knife. This was made after. This was made for the Great Exhibition. And is it... so it is definitely grander. Yeah, I love the Norfolk knife. I love the Ur knife, and we've got it over there. But there's this as well. Okay? Now, one of the things we're hoping to do is we're hoping to reunite these 2 knives in the front foyer of the museum in the next year. All rests on us being able to, well, it rests on us being able to borrow this, and one of the conditions about borrowing this is this in a condition that it can be moved. Interesting, sometimes the stand it's sitting on is slightly different. So this is as it is now. So this knife is in the cutler's hall, tucked in the corner of a room. So if you're lucky enough to move in those circles, you might get to see it regularly. Other than that, cutler's hall, Heritage Open Day, you can get in there, sometimes have weddings in there, sometimes have events. But I suppose generally the point would be it's not accessible, it's not as accessible as the Ur knife. The medals underneath would have been medals that would have been awarded exhibitions. So they had exhibitions all over the world, and these knives would have been taken out there, and they would have got medals for it. The Cymru history states it was made by William Bamford. Now, William Bamford is buried in Ward's End Cemetery, and I know the people who run Ward's End Cemetery have made a sort of point about that. The Manila pearl carving was made by Charles Levesey, and there's a company in Sheffield called Levesey Brothers. So again, I suppose it highlights that point. There was a significant amount of outworking took place. And I guess Rodgers would have said, who's the best person for doing this? And we'll get them to do it. Some speculation there might have been 2 knives. The earlier one made in 1840. Don't know. You know, you can't tell from the accounts whether they're both talking about the same knife or whether there were actually two. It weighs over 50 pounds and described as the largest knife in the world. It contains 75 blades and it's got a range of seams that are acid etched on the blades. So here we have it. So again, you can see the sort of detail. So one of the first things, of course, you would have said, if we're going to have royal warrants, let's have some royalty on it. You know, so the first blade up the middle, let's have a picture of a few bits of royalty. And then we go through a number of things. So, you know, you can recognise Windsor Castle on there. You can recognise the Britannia Bridge. You can recognise Crystal Palace is on there. I've seen it somewhere. Yeah, Crystal Palace is on there. The Capitol in Washington, D.C. is supposed to be on there. The Brighton Pavilion is supposed to be on there. And there's numerous other scenes. There's the suggestion that Chatsworth's on there, that Haddon Hall is on there. Now, in a sense, because we haven't had such access to it, we haven't, you know, if we have it here, we might have the opportunity to actually go through every blade and see what's actually on it. So again, you know, the ear knife doesn't have that decoration. It has the volume of blades. This has got a sort of different level of quality to it. It's got this central core that's been carved out of ivory, and got this hunting scene, you know, wild boar being killed. And again, you know, a sort of hint of some of the instruments, some of which are very obvious, and others that you think, what on earth, you know, I was looking pretty grand, pretty impressive. And of course, I suppose it's seeing that sort of tiering, you know, you've got at least 4 or 5 layers that the blades are actually coming out from. Yeah, and there's the base, so we've got different blades. I know there's some over there. This blade's quite interesting. It's called a fleam, and stockmen would have used it to draw blood from an animal. And you know, but there's other things there, and yeah, so just a really a fantastic object. And there it is in its totality. I think this image actually you can draw down from the internet. It's from the catalogue of the Great Exhibition in 1851. So that image is available, and that's almost to some extent the nicest image. And I guess, you know, pre-photography, or you know, when a photography wasn't generally available, that's the image that the public would have seen if they weren't looking at the original knife. So I guess if, you know, in the you know, the sort of London News or something, they published a picture of that, people would have thought, wow, that's exciting. Either I'm going to the Great Exhibition to see it, or I'm going to go to Sheffield to see it. Second showroom. You've got to get the elephant tusks in there. You know, and Sheffield did consume a huge amount of ivory, and that, you can look at that on the internet in another talk. But again, you know, just all sorts of things here. A couple of pairs of exhibition scissors. Although it's interesting, across the way we've got some scissors. We've got a display case of scissors that were exhibited at the Great Exhibition in 1851, and there's some that don't. They're not quite as good as that, but not dissimilar. And I know I was asking that question. I looked at them today and thought, I wonder who made them. I'm not sure. And we've got them on loan from a museum in Bradford, but I don't quite know who made the scissors. Right, this is quite interesting. So this is a couple of sort of contemporary accounts. So Rodger's showroom became an essential part of the Grand Tour of Northern England. It's interesting, just that concept of the Grand Tour of Northern England, isn't it? You know, but I suppose you'd gone to look at the caves in Castleton and things like that. But no traveller misses a visit to the showrooms and workshops of M. Rodgers, one of the most famous manufacturers in the town. One enters a gallery illuminated by large windows. You know, large windows, we take them for granted. But, you know, glass cabinets line the walls. In the middle, on a long mahogany table, weapons, knives, scissors, penknives, a multitude of steel instruments are laid out under glass globes, beneath glass frame cases, and several assistants have no other job than to rub and wipe things that the customers have touched. However long you take to examine this brilliant display, no one presses you. On the contrary, each assistant seeks to excite your curiosity and hasten to satisfy it. You can buy the least thing. You will be sold it with the same kindness as if dealing with an important article. So I don't know. Again, there just seems to be a sense there of customer care, you know, a sort of sense, is it a museum or is it actually a shop? And, you know, it sounds like you could go in and probably buy a little pocket knife, or you could go in and buy something that was really grand. And I like this other quote. So that was some Parisian, somebody from, well, it appeared in New York. The hungry eyes of the beggars as they stared through the windows of the coffee room at Sheffield made us hasten from breakfast to Rodger's cutlery showroom, full of steel marvels whose polished blades were the only brilliant tints observable in the town. You know, again, well, you know, contemporary accounts of Sheffield don't speak of it as being a very clean and impressive place. Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our latest project then. One of the notions is, obviously we had the ear knife, and there was something about saying, well, it's worth celebrating. So if we're celebrating the ear knife, can we assemble any other significant knives in Sheffield? This one's quite interesting, and it's actually on the table there. It's only got 100 and something blades, and it came to us purely by accident. We inherited a massive collection of tools from somewhere in Kent called Toolbank. And we got, I don't know, 25 crates plus. And volunteers were unpacking them, and they found this in the bottom of one of them. We didn't know we were getting it. I took every blade out looking for the word Sheffield and couldn't find it. And I was thinking it must have been made in Sheffield. One day, he didn't often come in on a Wednesday, the day I come in, but Stan Shaw was in. So I got it, took out the top 20 blades, and took it down to Stan and said, it was 92 at this point, what do you think of this, Stan? And he had a look at it and said, I think there's a mark there, lad. And actually, we took it back to the office, had a look under a glass, and somebody said, oh, it's a coffee pot. We turned it upside down. It wasn't a coffee pot. It was the mark of a golfer. And the golfer was a mark of somebody called Greenhow, who was a famous multi-blade knife maker, and then that mark was passed on to Edwin Blade. So we do know that that knife was made in Sheffield probably around the 1840s, okay? And it's something we, you know, so again, so that's another substantial multi-blade knife. There are some multi-blade knives at Sheffield Museum. There's some on display which we probably can't borrow, but there's some that are actually in their back store, if you like, that we will be able to borrow. The assay officer's got some knives we want to borrow, and the Norfolk knife's got some knives we want to borrow. I'll put the call out on the internet saying, anybody else in Sheffield got any smart knives? Yeah, some of you might have some of these sitting at home. It's quite nice. There's a guy called Steve Cocker. He's one of the contemporary makers of knives in Sheffield. You know, and he's making, we've already booked him and he's making a sort of knife. There's another company another family that we know that are collecting the knives made by their ancestor, and they've got a gold knife. We have got access to Geoffrey Tweedale, the biggest authority on knives in Sheffield, although he lives over in Disley. He's going to give us some Stan Shaw knives. So, but again, there is a bit of a sense of saying, can we assemble, for what might be a unique occasion, any of these significant knives? I say whether we get round to borrowing one from the Royal Collection, I'm not sure, but that's certainly possible. So one of the strands is two exhibitions really. One exhibition in the foyer here of the a number of substantial, for want of a word, so number 20 knives. Then also we'll have another exhibition of other pen knives later in the city during the project. So that's sort of like one strand. Sorry, there's Stan Shaw with one of the exhibition knives he made, the Hallamshire knife, while he worked for John Clark. The 11 blades are all different as an example of an old Sheffield pattern. So you know, Stan only died a year ago. So it's interesting, the skill to make those was still there. But the thing about Stan was he did everything, every stage of the knife, he did it himself. And certainly the family have got them. And some of Stan's knives have now gone in a display cabinet at the Cutler's Hall. The other thing we're looking to do, is to capture some of the great knives in a digital format that can be shared across the world. So at the moment, I guess, if you look at the ear knife, you'll see just sort of flat one-dimensional images, and we'd like to get some three-dimensional imagery done so we can put that on the internet. And one of the lessons we've learned from the last project, you know, the Name on a Knife Blade project, if you don't know about that, that's had 150,000 hits now in terms of people looking to see if their name is on a Sheffield knife blade. Our YouTube channel has had 250,000 hits. So, you know, if we can get it out there, we can get it shared with people. One of the things when we were bidding for this project from the Heritage Lottery, they more or less say, well, you've got to reach a new audience. With respect to the people in the audience, we're really good at reaching grey retired people, okay? You know, me included. And so there was a bit of a sense of, and if you say you've got a project and you're just going to reach grey retired people, we ain't going to give you any money. So one of the notions was, well, the original ear knife was about celebrating Sheffield. So one question is, what do people like about Sheffield now? So we've commissioned a sculptor, Jason Heppenstall, who's actually got a sculpture out the fish outside the railway station. And he's going to essentially make us a little Mester, only life-size, with a bench. But on that bench, there's going to be some tools. And inside those tools, you're going to be able to place a token about what you like about Sheffield. And those tokens are going to be designed by some young people who are working at the University Technical College down in the centre of town. So, you know, and actually, whereas I was thinking, oh, we're going to make a sort of frame that we're just going to hang things on and after a year we'd put it away, essentially it will be becoming another permanent feature of the Hawley Gallery. But, the other thing we're doing is actually we're cataloguing the knives that we've made in the collection and adding them to the Name on a Knife Blade database. So at the moment, Stan Shaw, Steve Cocker, Trevor Ablett, famous Sheffield knife makers, they are not on the Name on a Knife Blade database because they didn't make table knives. You know, we've got 1,600 cutlers on there, and they are companies that made table knives, but we actually want to add the pen and pocket knife makers on there, and hopefully we're actually going to add on maybe the razor makers as well there. So Sheffield people who were working with metal. And yeah, just there's a few things that are on the table, but you know, one of the things about any museum is 95% of what they've got is sitting in drawers, not available, not on display. And you know, every time we have to think what we're going to put on display. And if we have things that people really like we've got some giant tools, people love them, so they're on permanent display. But it means we never rotate that display. So it's great today to be able to bring some things out. And these were some, on the left there, you've got some sportsman's knives, which were very, very popular. Here you've got some sort of novelty knives. Some of them, you know, this one's probably a fruit knife that somebody might have had in the pocket, or it might have been a pen knife. That one's in the shape of a rifle. This one's in the shape of a boot, a fish, you know. So it's just nice to get these things out. We will be doing more work cataloguing these, and I would say probably in a year's time to have an exhibition where we will say what all the implements are for, what they're made of, and to paint that full picture. And really just to say, the two people that a lot of this information has come from, Geoffrey Tweedale, who he's written this massive tome about, well, he's written a number of books about knife making in Sheffield, and that's really good. And the Hawley collection, which was, you know, Ken Hawley collected lots of this stuff for the posterity, you know, of Sheffield, and we can enjoy them now. And yeah, thanks very much.